Thank you very much for coming to today's event. For those who are not familiar, I think I'm familiar with many people in the room, but not entirely. There's a couple of faces I don't recognize. My name's Guy Viner. I'm the Sullivan Chair of Irish Studies, and it's great to welcome you here for our Flatley lecture, which is one of our title lectures. It's one of our main events every year. Beforehand, a few general things. As you walk out of the room after the lecture, to your right on the dress or on the press, whatever it is there's a card with the whole program of events for the semester. And we still have a couple more events coming up. So if you want to attend other events, I'll flag them to you. It's worth going. Next week, I'll point out, usually our events are on Wednesday afternoons, as in today. But our event next week, because of Halloween, is on a Thursday, the day before Halloween, and it's Halloween related. It's a team of historians from the University of Ulster with Andrew Snedden, historian, who have turned their research on a witch trial in Ireland into a video game. So I'd recommend to come and hear how to turn your knowledge that you're learning at university here, that you're interested in, into IT money-producing avenues. Who says you can't make money out of history? So I'll encourage you to take that. We have some other really great events. My colleague Rob Savage, who should be, did I see him in the room over there? Rob is doing a great event after that on counterinsurgency and informers. Really interesting with some really big names. Please keep an eye out for that as well. So we've got some good events coming up before the semester ends. Please feel free to come. I'm particularly excited about today's event, but before that I'll tell you something personally for a moment. So I'm teaching a course next term, doing a bit of marketing here, on Ireland in the Age of Revolution. And a book just came out now with Oxford University Press on women in the Age of Revolution in Ireland. And our library got it remarkably quickly, so I went over to pick it up. And as I pick it up, and the point of looking at it, which will actually connect this point, is that I'm aware, having taught this course once before, Paloma was in that year when I taught it, right? Mm-hmm. I can't say anybody else was in that year, but Paloma was there. I'm aware of the fact that the course did not deal seriously enough or properly with gender. And it changes everything when you look at the period, when you bring gender in. It has to be brought in. It's not that some kind of politically correct imposition from somebody from above. It needs to be brought in, and definitely the role of women in the Age of Revolution is crucial in so many ways. So I was excited about this book coming out. It's been a long time in the coming of it. I know the author's been working on it for a long time. And as I went to pick it up, they have an exhibition. Has anybody been to the O'Neill recently? I'd like to hope the students go in there. Make a point, go into the library once a week at least, seriously. But as you walk in the O'Neill library, there's an exhibition on censorship. So there's all these books which have yellow cover, they've been censored, including a great man when it comes to censorship, our current president in America. His favorite book is there, which is the screenplay for Gone with the Wind. For Gone with the Wind, which is there, that was also subject to censorship at some stage. So you have censorship from all sides. Ayn Rand, all the names the Republicans cherish would also been subject to censorship in the past at different times. And of course, all the events, all the books on other sides of the political spectrum, everybody's been subject to censorship. And that made me think, and why I believe this talk today is so crucial in so many levels. First of all, it's not for nothing that I started the story relating to gender and an extent also to sexuality, I think both, but to gender specifically. It's a term which is crucial for us in academia to understand so many bodies of knowledge. And yet, gender is under assault specifically. Anything to do with gender or sexuality or reproduction, these are keywords which were used throughout the summer to close grants across universities in America and stop funding. Departments have closed different kind of programs. People are afraid to use it. People are scrubbing their CVs. Syllabi are being changed. We're under assault in a way which is quite remarkable. And the reaction shouldn't be to fold flags, but actually should be to talk about it more. And so that's why I think it's crucial in a sense of what's happening in today's talk and the topics we're dealing with, because exactly something strange has happened. In the past, the United States was known, academia in the United States, and even the general public, for being advanced in the sense that we, America, it's not me, I am not a citizen of this country, but, which means I could be deported for what I'm saying now, I guess, but America initiated many of these debates, defined the parameter, provided the vocabulary, and yet now America is closing down these debates. It's Europe, which was looking before that at America for discourse, which is leading the way. In many cases, Ireland is leading debates and opening new questions. So we've shifted our sense of attention. We've got to think about that, where the focus of gravity of intellectual attention is sitting. Unfortunately, we have Páraic Kerrigan here, whose interests are remarkable, both gender, sexuality, the way it's represented in media, but at the same time also censorship. There's the new book, there's a collection which just came out now, our library already has it, but I haven't got to get my hands on it yet, a new collection of essays which he co-wrote with colleagues at UCD on platforms of cancelling, right? Am I correct?
Yes.
So it's platforms of cancelling. So if you want to know an academic talk on cancel culture in today's social media world, and looking at it with critical, with critical theory, another word which is now banned in America, not allowed to use critical theory either, which is interesting. We're not allowed to use it, but that's the kind of word which the bots are scrubbing. The AI is being used to find out how to bring brought in. So another field that Páraic deals with is AI and information technologies. But Páraic is particularly well known for his work on gender and sexuality. An initial book which made his mark, I think, he's published a lot of articles, was his book on visualizing LGBTQ. And that's an historical book. It follows a chronology which shows the story of media history in Ireland and how LGBTQ was profiled at first hesitantly and how it appears in different places, ending with a discussion of, in the end, is it still token and where are we standing and what about areas which are not being discussed. I thought the ending chapter was particularly interesting. And then this book which came out, is it a year now or more than a year?
Yeah, it's over a year now.
Yeah, Reeling in the Queers. A bit misleading for a simple reason that reeling in the years, and I think there was an equivalent in America, but in Ireland, was a chronology of films. It was like going by year. This is not done. It's not done in chronological order. So it's a series of cases. Each one of them is highly readable. New Ireland Books, by the way, what a great venue to publish with, because it's the most exciting popular press now in Ireland. I think it provokes all these things. So it's a great venue. The book itself, I found the right publisher for it, I think, and each case is interesting. Each case starting with a lot of media, but not only with media, but when you go through the contents page here and you see from the very beginning Phil Moore's story as she's sitting in the studio there, the RTE studio, and hearing a discussion about homosexuality in Ireland, the kind of first public big discussion where the public is being brought to it, and she knows her own son is being misrepresented in the whole debate and has to break into the debate. But going through a whole series of cases one by one of the first gays boy band in Ireland and how that was put together, of homosexuality in the Irish Army and the whole history and problematic history around it, all the way through to the alternative Miss Irelands. And here I had to check the book because I had to see if my favorite one is there. Shirley Temple Bar has a section here, which is great.
Yes.
And I remember as a student, because Shirley Temple Bar, I remember as a student, because I used to go to the bingo sessions that she used to run at the George.
Oh, very good. Yes.
And then she began doing it on RT, mainstream.
She's still doing them.
Seriously?
Yeah.
That was brilliant. So you could just imagine, RT, the old age pensioners, were sitting. So when did this begin? Like early 2000s?
Yeah, so she won Alternative Miss Ireland in 1997, then did bingo in the George, and then someone from RTE saw her in the George and went, oh, that'd be great for TV, and everyone actually thought Shirley was a woman. And then one day found out, why is there a man? Because one day she just forgot her wig and just did it as Declan. And then everyone went, who's this random person? I was like, well, that's a drag queen. So that caused a bit of a consternation for a moment.
And it was just brilliant to see all the grannies and granddads sitting around checking out their bingo numbers with Shirley Temple Bar. It was just brilliant. The whole thing was there. So Páraic is here to give our Flatley lecture, which is great, from UCD. He's in information studies at UC Communication Studies, I should say. The communication department is it's got a full name. It's information and communication.
Information and communication studies.
Right, so that's a shining brand department in UCD, which wasn't there when I was a student, so it's great to see that. Before that, you were in Maynooth.
Yes, media studies at Maynooth.
Yeah, and from there I understand you got part of the IRC, which is Ireland's premium grant, and was a John Hume and Pat Hume's scholar. So it's quite a pedigree. But the real reason that Páraic was chosen here is, first of all, this was a grassroots decision. It was the grad students. We often try to help our grad students go in the summer to Ireland who noticed that the book was everywhere, that your book was the sensation of the summer in Ireland. So that really flagged the attention that we should invite you over. And in hearing today about the Hirschfeld Centre, it's remarkable because the centre wasn't around for that many years. And it's really interesting in terms of thinking about methodology of how you can access a history for an event, for a centre, which isn't documented that well, but then you can rely on memory and oral history fields which speak very strongly to at least my interests here. So Páraic, please, this would be great. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, thank you for such a warm welcome. So, gur míle mágad go léir as an bháilte críúla nocht an seo ag láiste Boston. Tá an dainarm an seo agus an deise all an popper agus an cur láthir seo ridliv agus asúlagum go méid sé ma. So forgive my pidgin Irish, which I'm currently trying to relearn along with many other Irish people since the Renaissance and the last number of years with kneecap and whatnot, who've actually made Irish cool again. It's always cool, of course, but yeah, and it's not lost to me that I'm here in the US at this particular cultural moment giving a talk like this on queer studies. And I would actually just like to give props to Boston College for actually programming an event like this. So let's actually give a round of applause for it. Because these topics are becoming silenced. The oxygen in the room is being taken out of discussing these very things. And so many students from North America are coming to the likes of UCD, Maynooth, UCC, escaping this context because they are afraid to study these very topics. But before I get into what we're here today to talk about the Hirschfeld Centre, what this was, how it functioned, and why it's really important, just some thank yous. So firstly, thank you so much for the warm welcome here, the hospitality at Boston College. And it's a pleasure to come here to deliver the Thomas J. Flatley Lecture. I would just like to start by thanking Rachel Young for the very kind and warm invitation to speak, along with Guy Viner for being such a generous host and for the really generous welcome. Joe Nugent also for the warm welcome and hospitality, and Patrick Mullen over here, who is from Northeastern, but Patrick gave me my very first ever speaking gig with Northeastern on their study abroad program with Joe Nugent. So thank you, Patrick, for giving me the confidence. And now here we are, full circle, 10 years later, nearly, 11 years later, I think. Yeah, aging us both there. And finally, Maria Ordenez for making the logistics of this incredibly easy. The easiest academic gig I've ever had. So Boston College, thank you very much. So today I'm going to talk about queer joy and loss at Dublin's Hirschfeld Centre. As Guy said at the very start, this centre did not exist for long. It was only there from 1979 to 1987. Like, very short length of time. But my argument, my thesis, my proposition to you all tonight would be, without the Hirschfeld Centre, there would be no queer Irish culture as we know it. There would be no decriminalisation of homosexuality in 1993, and there would be no same-sex marriage. There would be no marriage referendum and the success of that in 2015. This created a bastion, a generation of activists who went out into Ireland and the world and globally to create queer culture and enable future generations like myself to benefit from the activism and hard work of what they did. But the Hirschfeld Centre is also an archive, a fragile archive. The building itself burned down in 1987 in a suspected arson attack. So the building as it was, the structure is still there, but the inside was completely decimated. Similarly, many of the people who walked through the doors of that building passed on. Many died from AIDS-related illnesses, so their stories died with them. It is a reflection of an ephemeral archive, and with that, with ephemeral archives, oral histories are necessary to reconstruct, to recreate an archive, but also re-embed the story of the Hirschfeld. So what I'm going to do today is, I suppose, a talk of a number of parts. I'm going to kind of the density theoretical bit, which I'll be reading from the script at the start, as we all do with our theory, right? About embodied archives and effective histories, and my methodology, and a flexible methodology at that. Then, to actually talk about the Hirschfeld, I'm going to give the briefest of contexts with regards to queer space and place in Dublin and Ireland. So to get to the Hirschfeld, we just need to understand, where is this emerging from? How is it operating in the queer space that is Dublin, Temple Bar? And then I'm going to give you two of the kind of key findings from the oral histories. There's been many more, they'll all be in the book. The book is coming out with Liverpool University Press next year. It's due in November, but they don't know it. It won't be submitted until January. So that will be a conversation I will have with my editor very soon. But she's been great. Krista Valscape, who's fabulous, if any of you ever worked with her. So that is the kind of premise of today's talk. We'll go for around 45 minutes or so, just so you know when your expiry will come in, and then we'll do some Q&A afterwards, okay? I tend to be quite interactive as well, so if at any point you want to interrupt or ask a question, please feel free to do so. So I'm going to start with a bit of threshold crossing, because I too crossed the threshold of the Hirschfeld Centre, but I crossed it many years later, 40 years on. So here is me on a day in July in 2023. It is a blistering hot day in June 2023 as I walk through Temple Bar to meet a friend in a local queer bar, Street 66. I'm early and I have time to spare, so I decide to visit 10 Fownes Street Upper. I'm currently in the midst of data collection on the project Waking the Hirschfeld, which I've been working on with my collaborator Maria Maggiore for the last number of years. Having heard, researched and foraged through the archives, oral recordings and interview transcripts for the last number of months, I wanted to get a sense of this place. For the duration of the project, I've been in some sort of psychic exchange, caught between the past and the present myself, immersed in the memories and recollections of many people who had walked over the threshold of the Hirschfeld Centre. As I came to stand in front of 10 Fownes Street, that very building, I really felt the fragility of the Hirschfeld's archive, its memories. It's not the first time that I've come to admire the building and get a sense of my community's history. I have been many times. Oh, very dramatic, there we go, that's that off. I have been many times. The fragility of the archive, the contestation of the space. So in that hot June of 2023, I stood in a 10 Fownes Street in a temple bar that had been redeveloped into a tourist mecca and a site of commercial trade. The new central bank retail space just at the top of the street, bringing with it even more trade into the area, and actually houses Pokemon headquarters, believe it or not. Right around the corner from the Hirschfeld Centre. So global capitalism at work in Ireland. So in the exact spot I stood on over 45 years prior, many gay men and lesbians stood, pacing up and down, too nervous, scared, frightened to walk across that threshold. Standing with the ghosts of the past, and hearing the echoes of the many participants who told me about standing nervously where I stood, I suddenly realised I'd never actually been inside the building. With a rush of excitement, I took out my phone, tapped Spotify, connected my AirPods, and opened up the playlist Flikkers, the Hirschfeld's famous and iconic disco. I had started collating the playlist when I began my interviews because participants who spoke of the building, the site, invariably remembered it through song. I also have that playlist available for you all at the end if you want to tap into some of these great tracks. So scrolling through the list, I immediately pick Dead or Alive's You Spin Me Round. I had become particularly attached to this track after an interview with a participant who noted being shy on the edge of the Flikkers dance floor, but reported that when the track came on, he got a new wave of confidence and found a way to be himself. With Pete Burns' gravelly baritone voice blasting through my headphones, I stepped across the threshold, like so many queer people before me. The pull of the past and the memories of the project's participants, not far from me, I traverse what is now a vintage clothing shop. Above me is where the dance floor of Flikkers would have been. I imagine the bodies, sweating and clashing against each other, the swinging of the iconic disco ball, the smell of poppers, the mirrored walls, the bar to the side that could only sell fizzy drinks. I stand with the ghosts of the past. So, from that experience and affective emotionality of engaging with the Hirschfeld is kind of a jumping off point of where I get to in this project. Because we're not just necessarily concerned with oral history data collection, but we wanted to understand, how did these people feel? What feelings did they have walking around the site of the building? And the oral history became something very different in that context. So on St. Patrick's Day in 1979, the Hirschfeld Centre opened its doors on 10 Fownes Street and became one of the most significant institutions in queer Irish history. In 1987, the building was irreparably damaged by a fire in a suspected arson attack. Suspected as arson because the very week after, Sides nightclub, just around the corner on Dame Street, was similarly attacked in a fire. Despite operating for only 8 years, the Hirschfeld's political, social and cultural activities made it a key space for an emerging queer community and an important site of development for queer Irish culture. This was particularly relevant in the 1980s Ireland, where sex between men was criminalised and remained so up until 1993, fostering a homophobic, conservative society hostile to queer people. Sites like the Hirschfeld, and there were precious few of these, from Cork's Ski Co-op being another such location, were vital incubators for queer placemaking, offering spaces of creativity, safety, and community. So in this talk, I aim to argue, I hope, that the Hirschfeld has served as a focal point for individual and collective remembrance in the decades since its closure. I suppose our propulsion for thinking about this in terms of remembering, remembrance, and commemoration came in the decade of the centenary, right? The decade of commemorations where we and it got critiqued a lot for leaving gender out of the question, and that was redressed to some degree, but sexuality, particularly of our revolutionaries, many of which were, like Roger Casement, queer, Páraic Pierce, queer, was sort of left out of the picture to some extent. So that kind of frustrated us and propelled us to want to set up some sort of queer commemoration around this institution and building. So we use oral history interviews with community members who experienced the Hirschfeld during its operation to examine complex and ambivalent emotions that they expressed as they recall one of the most crucial spaces in their lives. So our method emerged out of necessity and flexibility, and we combined close and distant listening, a method we've developed, with 3 modes of oral history narration. So we had traditional oral history interviews where we put out a call for people to say to us, we were at the building, we want to interact, we want to engage. We then also did group interviews. So group oral history interviews. How did they emerge? They emerged via lesbians. So lesbians said to us that we actually never operated as individuals. We never necessarily operated within these hierarchical structures of community activism. What we actually did instead was we operated as collectives. So they requested, could we do our interviews for the oral history as a collective? And of course, we were flexible and adaptive and responded to them as such. And that was another method that we developed there. And our third one was walking oral history interviews. We got some participants and we walked around Temple Bar with them, around the Hirschfeld Centre, around the Central Bank, and wanted to get the emotionality of how they felt when they were going to this building for the first time. The anxiety that crippled them, the lots of drink they had to consume to even just get across the threshold. All of this emotionality comes from them actually being placed right there on the cobbled streets of Temple Bar, facing this building that was at one point in their life, the biggest threat to them, but became their bastion of safety. So we do this because we want to enhance and capture the complex emotional intersections, but also the spatial and temporal displacements involved in actually remembering the Hirschfeld, and engage more deeply with its dual status as an emblem of both queer joy and loss. The method necessarily relied upon our own differential embodiments and disjunctive temporalities as a process of analysing and interpreting our participants' testimonies. We emphasise that we engage with these testimonies not hierarchically, but differentially. Our effective responses and processes of reflection, as well as our connection to and distance from the narratives as invested in researchers in different spaces and times, informed how we also read these interviews. So possibly our most theoretically dense part of the lecture, and then I'm going to bring you into the really good stuff that came from the oral history interviews. And lots of them, unsurprisingly when you're running a community centre, lots of drama and tensions. And hurt that's still, of course, which I will share with you naturally enough, I have permission to do so, and kind of just strange gossipy things that kind of tend to emerge in these oral histories as well. And then of course personality clashes and differences and community hurt. So in his work on collective memory, Zerubbabel suggests that place can ground memory, establishing a physical connection through location, such that events happen at different times feel contiguous. The seeming stability of physical place, he argues, can focus personal and group nostalgia to create a sense of identity across time. Similarly, Till and Cosito Arponen highlight the importance of memory's connection to place, emphasising the need for responsible geographies of memory, where diverse stakeholder narratives are respected. Significantly, taking such an approach to considering memory and place would accordingly be open to spatial, social, and temporal complexities and contradictions, and might allow for understanding different forms of belonging. This approach is key to understanding the Hirschfeld Centre, as it highlights in and of itself the spatial, social, and temporal complexities of memory, revealing contradictions in personal recollections and, crucially, diverse forms of belonging that the building nurtured. And the diverse forms, and I was with the grad students earlier, and they were asking about the diverse forms of recollection that many of the project participants had. And that in of itself has led to conflict. I was giving a talk in relation to the Hirschfeld in the Mansion House in Dublin during Pride, and one of the things I said was that there has been a dispute over whether there was a snooker table on the ground floor of the Hirschfeld Centre. Only lesbians ever remember the snooker table. Gay men always discounted that it did not exist. And then this row starts to emerge in the room between the participants, between the gay men who said, that there was never a pool table in the Hirschfeld Centre, that's fiction, versus the lesbians going, this is gay male privilege, this was very important to the lesbian community, and you just completely are writing this off and privileging a gay male narrative. And this kind of tension emerged within the room. And that kind of reflects the contestation and the ambivalence of memory within these oral histories. And how do you kind of parse out truth, fact, fiction in these instances? So drawing upon research that explores the connection between space and emotion in social movements, Milo Batocci argues the affective dimensions of queer spaces are critical to queer activism, and thus the consideration of physical structures such as bars and community centres is a crucial element of queer historical research. Batocci contends that too often conflict and negative affections and emotions are often minimised when researchers overlook the complex material aspect of these queer spaces. And we tend to sometimes overlook those negative aspects. You'll see in a few instances where a number of people described to me becoming alcoholics because they said to get across the threshold of the Hirschfeld Centre, they had to drink. And they started to binge drink to get the confidence to go into a queer space. And they said that resulted in them having significant substance abuse issues later in their lives. And I was critiqued in some instances by other kind of historians in Ireland for including those stories, but I'm of the opinion that firstly, these people want them included, and secondly, the negative emotion, affections, and emotionality of these instances are part of the story. You can't just cut out and slice off the bits that aren't neat, or aren't sexy, or aren't clear-cut. You've got to include the negative as well. So, further developing the significance of conflict, Owen et al. Consider discomfort a productive emotion that can highlight the potential for change, reflection, and living together in turbulent times. So, within this then, building on Zerubbabel, Till, we argue that the Hirschfeld Centre, as a reconstructed brick building sporting a commemorative plaque now, but more importantly, as a remembered and imagined site, continues to serve as an anchor for individual and collective queer memory, embodying joyful triumphs and painful losses at the complex intersection of personal and communal histories. The memories tied to the centre are not uniform, but layered with contradictions, as different individuals recall it through the lenses of their unique experiences, of their sometimes intimate engagement, such as dancing at a disco or having sex on the roof, which many did, nearly collapsing it, by the way, and distant consideration, such as hearing about the fire that destroyed the building while living outside of the Republic of Ireland. Many of the people, the denizens who used the Hirschfeld Centre, came here to Boston. I actually have a nice little story I'm going to wrap up the talk with of the Boston connection here, so hold tight for that. So these narratives reveal not just the emotional and social significance of the space, but also how physical sites like the Hirschfeld Centre become ephemeral and yet embodied affective archives, shaping and reflecting individual and collective identities, and creating the possibility of continuity even after the place itself is gone. Thus, the physically present and yet also absent Hirschfeld Centre serves as a Derridian trace, an impression left by an absence. It remains a powerful symbol of queer heritage, born in a specific time and place, Dublin in the 1970s, with its yearning towards queer cosmopolitanism and an exuberant urban dance culture, and underscores the deep connection between place, memory, and identity that queer historians are increasingly recognising as key to the history of gay and queer bars and community centres. So that's sort of theoretically where we're coming in terms of our methodology, in terms of what we're trying to do with regards to space and place. So to get to the Hirschfeld Centre, I'm going to take you through the briefest of surveys of making queer space and forging queer places. Because to get to a physical site like the Hirschfeld Centre, what we get is a constellation of bars, a constellation of spaces that begin to emerge from the founding of the Irish Free State in 1922. And from that founding, lots of bars, queer nights, queer clubs have come and gone. One of the earliest instances that in the official record, Paul Gandon describes within theatre and soap operas, or opera circles even, where suede shoes signaled affiliation. So if you were wearing suede, you were one of the gays, right? You were in the community. And then with the Eucharistic Congress in 1932, Pissoirs, Parisian-style pissoirs emerged around the city to enable the crowds, and these became cruising sites. Shock horror, it was a Eucharistic Congress, attracting a lot of people within the clergy, but naturally enough, this resulted in the Eucharistic Congress becoming quite a hotbed for ephemeral sex within toilets. And toilets become a crucial meeting space for much of the 20th century for the community. So these are some of the earliest instances. And then you have instances like the Gresham and the Shelburne. The front bars of these hotels become really prominent for middle-class gay men who would meet there on Saturday afternoons. And so what I'm saying here is there's no designated queer space in the middle of the 20th century. It's bars that are being claimed as gay for a few hours by members of the community, but otherwise there is no dedicated space. So from the 1930s onwards, pubs and cafes across Dublin gained reputations then as gay-friendly. Davy Burns, which is still there on Duke Street, possibly run by a gay proprietor. Rumour has it Davy Byrne himself was gay. And they suspect he was gay because he was buried with a male companion. So generally, historians tend to think that one can lead to that. Mary McAuliffe's work suggests so. And so this becomes a really discreet hub, especially for theatre folk from the nearby Theatre Royal. The Bailey, which again still stands and still quite gay sometimes, attracts a more professional. So judges, for example, and lawyers would have gone to the Bailey in the 1950s. And again, you're kind of seeing this is still quite class-based, right? So the middle class, upper crust gays, and generally gay men go towards these sorts of establishments. After hours, the infamous catacombs at 13 Fitzwilliam Place become really popular. And you also have Bewley's Cafe on Grafton Street. That was especially popular for people meeting midday for coffees, teas. And all of these institutions contributed towards what I call a quiet network of semi-public queer spaces, hidden in plain sight. You could go there without having to out yourself. The establishments didn't self-declare themselves as gay, but they were there as some form of socialization once a week. So this is the sort of queer space and placemaking we see at the mid-century point, right, in the 1950s and the 1960s. So this begins to change ever so slightly then when we come into the 60s, the late 50s, 60s, and 70s. So we get two prominent self-designated gay bars, and forgive, I will share these slides afterwards, they are text heavy, forgive me. So you have Bartley Dunn's and Rice's. And Bartley Dunn's is on Stephen's Green, and it becomes beloved throughout the 1950s. And one fun fact I will tell you about Bartley Dunn's is one day there is a civil servant who clocks off from work, Michael Murtagh. He goes into Bartley Dunn's, he sits at the bar and he orders a pint of Guinness. So he's given the pint of Guinness, and it's just before the rush after work, so he's there sitting down anyways, and all of a sudden this big hunk of hot stuff walks in the door and he goes, oh God, he does not look Irish, and that man looks indelibly familiar. Who the hell is he? So anyways, this man, who's very handsome, walks to the bar, also orders a pint of Guinness. So Michael turns around and he goes, oh, you don't look like you're from around here, what's your name? And he goes, well, my name is Rock Hudson. So Michael goes to himself, oh, right, okay, Rock Hudson, my God, one of the most famous men in the world right now. He clearly doesn't know he's in a gay bar, so I won't let him know, I'll let him enjoy his pint. But Rock sits down with the pint, starts chatting with Michael. He's shooting a movie with Julie Andrews across the road in the Olympia, which is the theatre facing Bartley Dunn's. And, I forget what the movie was called, it evades me now. But anyways, he was shooting with Julie Andrews, and in between takes, they had some hours to spare, so he would go across to Bartley Dunn's. So anyways, Michael goes to himself, he'll be leaving soon because once he sees all the gay men coming in, he'll be like, I'm in the wrong place. But no, the gay men come in, and Mikey quickly realised Rock was exactly where he wanted to be and needed to be. So Bartley Dunn's was, and that demonstrates that even globally, right, you could have a Hollywood superstar come to Dublin, go to a space like Bartley Dunn's, which did self-declare itself as gay, but he could go in relative anonymity. And no one outed him, no one went to the press, no one went and said anything. And he had many of the men I spoke to had a very fun weekend. There was a fight at the end of the night to get into the car with Rock, and Rock said, one of you can get in, it's fine, but decide amongst yourselves. So they're all battling to get into the back of the car to go back to the Gresham where he was staying. So Bartley Duns was, David Norris actually says, that's where the theatrical old queens used to go there in his memoir. And maybe unfair, lots of people have said David was unfair in that claim. Then we also had Rice's, which was also at Stephen's Green, but faced South King Street as well. It had 2 entrances. And this offered a welcoming front bar for Dublin's lesbian and gay community. And despite the owner's, so the owner consistently in Rice's would say, this is not a gay bar. If 2 people kissed, 2 lesbians or 2 gay men, it's like, stop kissing, this is not a gay bar. But of course, it was taken over and it was well known as this gay bar. So it had 2 sections. The front part was referred to as the geriatric ward, where the older gays would go. And then the back section would be where the younger patrons would go. So these are 2 of the prominent spaces where, as we move towards the founding of the Irish gay rights movement in 1974, spaces are beginning to become a little bit more confident and self-designated. There is a commercial arm to the community where they see the community as a potential audience for, or consumer of, drinking. So other notable spots are the Viking Bar on Dame Street, Pygmalion, the St. William, and the Pembroke. So all of these are kind of ephemeral spaces that emerged for a few years. Some remain permanent. The Viking is now gone, but really well remembered. And these all exist and coexist at the same time as the Hirschfeld. And some people use these as a means of pre-drinking before going to the Hirschfeld to build up that Dutch courage. So what I'm saying here is, and why I'm giving you this crash course on queer spaces in Dublin, is that the Hirschfeld doesn't exist in isolation, but as part of a broader constellation. I do think it's the most important, by the way, but it is not existing on its own. So to then get to the Hirschfeld, we need to understand the rise and fall of the Irish gay rights movement. So before I get to the really good stuff, the Irish gay rights movement is founded in 1974 by David Norris, Edmund Lynch, and Bernard Keogh. They essentially established this movement because they want to, 1, demystify stereotypes around gay life, and 2, they want to implement gay law reform. They want to decriminalise homosexuality and formally go to courts. They quickly realise for them to have any kind of cohesion, they need a space. For a movement to work, for a movement to have continuity, a space to house the organisation is necessary. So they get 46 Parnell Square, beside the Sinn Féin office. Funnily enough, that was an interesting dynamic, let's just say. So they're beside the Sinn Féin office and they establish a queer disco, a cinema, a quasi-cinema, and a phone line. So this is the beginning of a movement. But very quickly, the space essentially falls apart. Male dominance and leadership isolates lots of the lesbians, a tale as old as time in community queer histories. And then of course there's the personality clashes. So David Norris clashes with Sean Connolly. Half of the Irish gay rights movement don't like the fact that David Norris is very public and he's bringing attention to them, and they want less attention as a result. Whereas David Norris is of the opinion more attention is necessary because we need it to progress our cause. So all of these things result in the split, and the IGRM falls apart. They also lose their space in Parnell Square because of the fact that they were renting. So the space itself was ephemeral. So from here, there are legacy issues and lessons learned. A void emerges in the Irish LGBTQ community where there is no activism, there's no movement, and they quickly realise that to actually create a space, the community, if they come together, will have to own it. So this becomes the model for the Hirschfeld. The lessons of the past, the divisions, the conflict, all feeds into the fact that if we are to come together as a movement, we have to own the space that we create. And that brings us to waking the Hirschfeld, right? So that is all the context to this project in terms of how does the Hirschfeld Centre actually emerge. So after the IGRM split, 25 key people meet at David Norris's home on North Great Georgia Street. While in David Norris's home, they all say to themselves, we need to get a building. So David quickly goes about the city trying to find somewhere, and he happens upon Temple Bar, an old warehouse. So Temple Bar at the time is not the tourist mecca that you possibly are all familiar with. It was, to put it quite frankly, from one of my participants' oral history interviews, a shithole. There was nothing there. There was foxes, there was car parks, there was sex workers, there was some vegetarian cafes, there was some vintage clothing shops. Rents were really, really cheap in the area at the time, so lots of the bohemian arty types would emerge to the area, and it was a dangerous place. At one point, Éireann Road Éireann, or the Bus Éireann, I should say, the Irish government was going to level Temple Bar entirely and make it the national bus station. So this is all in the works at the time. So as a result, rents and prices of real estate were really cheap. So David Norris happened upon Fownes Street, and the building in which it's referenced, it was mentioned in Dubliners, this very building, and David Norris felt that this was a sign, right? I think the building was a tea room in Dubliners, in Joyce's, one of the short stories, I don't know which one, but David felt, okay, this is a sign, this Joycean connection here is contouring the future of the Irish gay rights movement. So he got a lease in the building, and there we have it. So the Hirschfeld Centre emerges. So volunteers transform this dilapidated warehouse with extensive renovations, fire safety upgrades, and creative reuse. So the building is completely dilapidated, but they work together to get it up to scratch. RTE, so are you all familiar with the Eurovision Song Contest? Yes, okay, so RTE had a national song contest to pick Ireland's entry to go to the Eurovision. So one day Edmund Lynch was walking by the set. RTE had thrown out the National Song Contest set. It was just sitting in the back lot, going to be incinerated. And Edmund was like, oh, what are you doing with this? And they were like, oh, we're burning it. He goes, can I rob it? And can I make this the dance floor of Flikkers, the disco? And they went, we don't care, do what you want. So yeah, he took the National Song Contest stage, and that was repurposed to become the dance floor on the first floor of Flikkers. So yeah, there's just, and this is the thing with oral histories, you get all of these origin stories, all of these tidbits that you'd never necessarily get from archival sources, which you can of course get sometimes. So beyond the disco then, as I just mentioned, Flikkers, we have a 55-seat cinema, which becomes the first and only gay cinema in Ireland. It's called the Hirschfeld Biograph, run by Johnny McAvoy. There is a community library, which begins by John Broderick, the Irish gay writer, donating his books to it, and it starts emerging as a library of sorts. And it becomes a crucial social, cultural, and political heart to Dublin's queer community, and Ireland's queer community. So, just to ask you, you're setting up a building for the Irish gay community, you're establishing yourself. Why the Hirschfeld Centre, right? And this is a really interesting question that I kind of raised, because I went, surely if we're going to set up an Irish community centre for the queer community, why not the one that's there for the taking, the Oscar Wilde Centre, right? So that was actually something that I raised with many people. And they actually really interesting questions. One, born out of pragmatism. Two, born out of a really nice ideological idea. I'll start with the latter. The early movement was very much aware of queer history in Europe, Weimar Germany, but also Magnus Hirschfeld, the German sexologist who developed the Institute for Sex Research in Germany in the 1930s and throughout the 1920s. When Hitler rose to power and when the Third Reich came to prominence, they essentially burned Hirschfeld's Sex Institute and completely destroyed a lot of his really developed thinking around sex, gender, and sexuality. So this was seen by the Irish gay community at the time as a means to connect to a queer cosmopolitanism of sorts, to honour Europe, to honour European queer history, and that's also seen with the pink triangle in a few slides' time, which I'll show you. But also, it was born out of pragmatism. If David Norris and Edmund Lynch went to the Irish banks with the Wilde Centre, they felt that they would risk not getting the mortgage to buy the building. So the Hirschfeld Centre served a pragmatic use of engaging with mainstream Ireland that they could circumnavigate around all of the homophobia and issues that could possibly emerge. So that's why it was called the Hirschfeld Centre rather than the Wilde Centre. It gave them a camouflage to operate for a number of years. So I'm going to now give you some of the key pieces and findings that emerged, but 60 oral history interviews, and I'm still gathering them. I'm still speaking with people. The book is due in November, now January, but people are still sharing their oral histories, and I will listen to their oral histories whenever they want to share it with them. They may not make it into the book, but suffice to say, we started data collection in 2021. Was meant to be finished in 2024, but that is not the case. Also, we're relying on archival research from the Irish Queer Archive and the National Library of Ireland, but we can only get so much about the Hirschfeld Centre, because when the building was destroyed, a lot of the documents about the hierarchy, the structure, were destroyed in the fire. If you go into the Irish Queer Archive, there are some pages still there that have singed edges. They're the pages that were saved from the fire on that very night in 1987. So, 60 oral history interviews with an iterative and flexible methodology. 3 oral history methods, the actual one-to-one interviews. Some were on Zoom, because some people were afraid of, starting during COVID, so people were afraid to meet, so we met online. Then we had group interviews, and then we had the grounded walking interviews, all of which brought really interesting recollections and forms of memory and memorialization. So from this, you get, of course, ambivalent and contested recollections. Some people will, in their oral history interviews, say they remember it via music. So, for example, David Moore said to me he remembers it via Dead or Alive. If he thinks of the Hirschfeld, when he walks by the building, Pete Burns' gravelly baritone voice emerges to him. He feels the need to listen to it on Spotify, like I did at the very start of, as I mentioned, this lecture. So some people mention it or will remember it through music. Others via dance. Dancing poorly, but dancing nonetheless. And the Hirschfeld was pretty radical in terms of its dancing, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes' time. Activism, managing phone lines, working in the cafe, the existence of a bar or a cafe. Was there a bar? Was there a cafe? The Hirschfeld was not allowed to sell alcohol, so it could only sell coffee and fizzy orange. Now people used to wear cowboy boots, and they'd put their naggins of vodka into their cowboy boots, and yeah, so that was a recollection of sorts. But outside of that, what I crucially wanted to look at was not just the people who were involved in the community activism, leaders of the movement, how did this building work, but just the regular person who was living in Roscommon or Donegal, and this was their only outlet once a month, to come to this building for a night, come to Flikkers, kiss, dance, maybe have sex with somebody, and then go home to what is their conservative life where they can't be who they are. And we wanted to capture those stories. In one instance, there was a guy from Carlow, no joke, who he was a farmer, used to drive his tractor up from Carlow, parked it outside the Hirschfeld Centre to go into Flikkers, and would then drive the tractor home. And he was like, this is my only way of getting any sort of action. And I drove that tractor, and yes, it was slow, and yes, it was painful, but that was my means of getting access to this building once a month. He was like, it's not something I could do every week because it's a long drive, but nonetheless. So yes, and funnily enough, in other people's oral history interviews, they always say to me, and I just always remember this tractor outside. And I don't understand why there's this tractor. And as I went on with the interviews, I then found Tractor Man, as I kind of labelled him in my kind of, on my mood board, as it were. I kind of put these figures up, right? So people mention people, and I try and see if I come. Another one was the Dowager Countess of Kilkenny, who was this catty queen who used to go and be like really bitchy and whatnot. Found the Dowager Countess of Kilkenny. He was pretty fabulous. But yeah, you get all of these connections that you can then put together from the constellations, like Tractor Man from Donegal. So these are just some of the ambivalent ones. And then these are the key themes that are forming the chapters that we're writing right now. So unwanted guests and unexpected visitors. So what do we mean by unwanted guests and unexpected visitors? So in one instance, Bill Hughes went in there, and his childhood bully, who had made his life hell, was there. Then we had another one who went, so this is a funny one, a guy who was a seminarian in Maynooth, St. Patrick's College. He saw that there was a youth group every Sunday in the Hirschfeld Centre from 3 o'clock to 6 p.m. So one day, because the college shut down and priests couldn't get out, so he climbed the walls of St. Patrick's College, went into Maynooth Village, got a bus, the 66, into town, and then came to Temple Bar. Too nervous to go into the building the first time, he went home. But then he kicked himself when he got back to his cell in St. Patrick's College, So he went, no, I'm going back next week and I'm doing this. So the very next week, he climbs the wall again, goes in, and who does he see? His next door roommate, also there. And he goes, what are you doing here? And he was like, what are you doing here? So here you have two priests, two seminarians, both at the NGF youth group. So those are the kinds of things that people encountered in the Hirschfeld. People seeing their married parents, their parents and their friends who would be married, seeing their husbands there, and unexpectedly. So the Hirschfeld, because there were so few spaces, brought with it these forms of social connection, because people are all there for that one reason that shares and connects them, right? Their sexual identity, the fact that they're part of this community. And as a result then, they will see very random people. AIDS and HIV activism was a significant part of the Hirschfeld Centre. It was in the Hirschfeld Centre that Ireland's first AIDS phone line was created. It was in the Hirschfeld Centre that the very first AIDS information leaflet that was distributed across Ireland was published and created. And it was also in the Hirschfeld Centre that people could get access to condoms, which at the time were illegal in Ireland and could only be gotten if you were, one, married in a heterosexual relationship, obviously, and two, got a prescription from your doctor. So imagine having to go to a doctor to get a prescription for a condom. Such was the case in Ireland under the Family Amendment Act. So radical activism is significant. There's lots of schisms and divisions ideologically in terms of the kind of activism within the Hirschfeld. You have Trotskyites, you have Marxists, who are very radically opposed to the mainstream movement in terms of its hierarchy and structure. You also have connections and coalitions, such as with Northern Ireland, for example, and I'll speak to that in a few minutes. Northern Ireland, Jeff Dudgeon, copied and pasted the structure of the Hirschfeld Centre and used it to develop the Carpenter Club in Belfast. The Carpenter Club only lasted a number of years, but the Hirschfeld became a model for Northern Irish queer activism to create a community space. Children of the Hirschfeld, one of the most emotional interviews I had happened towards the end of an interview with Mary Kelly. Mary Kelly was a lesbian who was active in the NGF youth group. And we were coming to the end of our interview, and I just said to Mary, is there anything else you want to say about the Hirschfeld? Have we kind of covered every ground? Just to kind of give her some space. And she just actually got emotional, started crying, and she just went, I will always be a child of the Hirschfeld. If I can meet the Hirschfeld today, I would thank it. And from that, it sparked the idea of those people who were actually reared by this building. People who were thrown out of their houses, and this was the only place for queer youth to go, where they found solace, where they found a community, and where they built community for themselves. So the children of the Hirschfeld then became a significant chapter, which I just finished last week, so very fresh in my mind. The talk today will focus on these two, shared and fractured first encounters, so people's first encounters with the Hirschfeld, and then fragmented remembrance and the politics of dance, so Flikkers. So let us get into our shared and fractured first encounters. So whenever I ask, and yes, these are all from Flikkers Dance Floor, by the way, you can see them all having a great time. So the shock horror, when I ask people, how did you emerge and encounter the Hirschfeld for the first time, many of them actually refer to their very first visit to the Hirschfeld as encountering Oz. They refer to themselves as Dorothy walking up the cobbled stones of Temple Bar, their version of the Yellow Brick Road, as it were, walking up towards the building and feeling like inside there was, and many have said this, I thought there was going to be the den of ill repute. I thought it was going to be Sodom and Gomorrah. It was going to be a perpetual orgy. I thought it was going to be slings everywhere and it was going to be disgraceful. And then they cross the threshold and they go, oh, this is actually quite boring. It's nothing that I built it up in my head. So a lot of participants, as I say, all gay men, referred to themselves as Dorothy crossing that threshold when describing their first encounter. But what was really interesting was how ritualistic practices start to emerge. Walking around Temple Bar, anxiety-ridden. And I too could relate to that. My very first time going to a gay bar was the George in 2010. And I remember pacing up and down North Great Georgia Street, wondering, oh my God, what is this going to be like? Will my world fall apart if I go in there? Will someone I know see me? All of these things run through your head. You build it up. And ritualistic first encounters with these spaces became a really significant aspect of this. So some people encountered the Hirschfeld very differently. Some were via phone line, telling them it existed. Some encountered it via magazines, in Dublin Magazine. Some heard it through whisper networks. Others heard about it and would pace around the building. So helplines become crucial gateways that turn isolation into connections. And we have volunteers that bridge public and private worlds. One of my, I always say, I'm saying this with one of my favorite interviewees, I'm saying that quite a lot, but another one of my favorite interviewees was a guy, Paul. And Paul said, I discovered that Tell a Friend, the helpline within the Hirschfeld Centre, existed. I wanted to make contact with the Hirschfelds. I wanted to know about it. So his family had put in an order to get a phone line in his house, but the waiting list in Dublin at the time was 2 years to get a phone installed. So he had to go into his neighbour's house to go to her bedroom upstairs to use her phone to make his first contact with Tell a Friend. So he's there whispering really quietly in his neighbour's house on her phone to make this first contact, where someone says, okay, we'll meet you in Temple Bar, we'll just make sure you're okay with us, that we're okay with you, and we'll take you into the building. So it serves as this bridging from a private world, anxiety-ridden, in a bedroom, to going into this very public world of the Hirschfeld Centre itself. So it creates community and new possibilities. So courage and fear are a significant aspect of this. So people having a slow personal rite of passage. For many, the hardest part of going to the Hirschfeld Centre experience was not what happened inside, but finding the courage to enter. And within that was an innate act of bravery. Stories from the likes of John Kilcullen, Paul Rudden, and Owen Casserly reveal how standing outside, pacing the block, or sitting in the car was an emotional battle that they had to contend with. John Kilcullen, for example, refers to driving outside, in one instance beside a tractor, and being parked outside the Hirschfeld, across the road, watching people walking in and out. And it took him 3 times to ritualistically go through this before he went in. Similarly, Owen Casserly took a number of times walking around the block to try and get into the building. So crossing the Hirschfeld's threshold unfolded over days, weeks, or multiple failed attempts. And we always see this hesitant approach, a circling of the block. And when we started to hear about the participants talking about circling the block, that's when we came up with the idea of doing grounded walking history interviews, right? We wanted to actually go with some of these people and retrace their steps to see what came back. One of our participants, Kieran Coleman, he was telling us the story where he said that he was walking by the Hirschfeld. It was about his 6th attempt to try and get through the building. And as he was walking by, the door opened and a light shone out. And he could hear the music coming from the Flikkers dance floor. And the song playing was Whitney Houston's I Want to Dance with Somebody. And all he could think to himself was, I really do just want to dance with somebody. That's all I want. I want to get through this threshold. I want to go up there and connect with somebody. And we brought him back then to the site after that interview because we thought it was a really powerful disclosure and testimony. And he got really emotional. We were walking around and we were across and he just goes, yeah, I still remember this. I still remember my heart beating, feeling sick, anxiety-ridden, and he actually had this really, really emotional time. And then he retraced us around the central bank, showed us where the bus stop was that he took. All of these things started to emerge from that oral history interview, from walking around, that we wouldn't have gotten had we just sat down. Which is why we need to be flexible, which is kind of one of the points I make at the end, in terms of how we do oral history interviews. And somewhat imaginative and creative. So here's just some testimonies here. So we had heard that, this is from Jerry Moore, we'd heard it was a gay disco and it might be fun to go to. A friend and I were scared of it. We didn't know what to expect. When we walked in the door, we had to have a good few pints beforehand because we didn't want anyone to see us. Going in there was a lot of bashing going on. It took a bit of courage for us to go in. And many other people have described consuming considerable amounts of alcohol to get across the building and subsequently developing substance abuse issues. From that, I want to actually go in a little bit specific of one of the more beautiful stories that emerged, which is that of the story of Bernie and Helena. And the story of Bernie and Helena came to me through the most are circumstantial of instances, where I was giving this talk on the Hirschfeld for Pride, in that instance where the row emerged over the snooker table, and Bernie and Helena came up afterwards and said, Páraic, we met in the Hirschfeld 45 years ago, and this is how we met, it brought us together. Both of our first times there, we saw each other, and we fell in love. So they said, could you please come out, and can we please share our story with you? So I went, 100%. So I went out, they bought in croissants, we had coffee, and they told me their story. So this is that oral history and kind of adapted from what is now in the book. So, in July 2025, on a sticky but overcast day, I sit with Helena and Bernie in their kitchen in Rathgar, South Dublin. And as they told me about these first encounters with the Hirschfeld, Bernie started to laugh awkwardly, becoming slightly embarrassed. All three of us began to catch laughter around the table as we drank coffee and tea and ate croissants. A month earlier, I'd given a public lecture on the Hirschfeld for Dublin City Council's Oak Room Heritage Talks. Afterwards, Bernie and Helena had approached me to introduce themselves, telling me they met in the Hirschfeld and had been together for many years. We exchanged numbers and I arranged to call out to them a number of weeks later. And now I was waiting to hear the details about how their love story began. Helena started smiling at Bernie and said, I went to the Hirschfeld, and the next thing I see is this Colleen here, Bernie beside me. I'm sitting at the window, looking at the dance floor, at everybody, and Bernie is along the side, and she keeps peeping out to have a look at me, and she thinks, God, wouldn't that be grand for a one-night stand? Bernie immediately interrupted, laughing, no, for the weekend. Helena continued to tease her, saying, every time she came out, I would wink at her, and she would jump back. So I asked her up to dance, and the first thing she said to me was, don't say that, Bernie cuts in, suddenly shy, though still laughing. I encouraged Helena to keep going, and she grinned at me before turning back to Bernie. The first thing she said to me was, do you come here often? And I said to myself, oh Jesus Christ. They both laughed at the memory, and then more quietly, they began to describe the moments that followed. The dance, they said, was electric. There was no question that something had sparked between them on that women's night in the Hirschfeld Centre more than 43 years ago. There was a connection. I knew there was something there, Bernie said, more serious now. Helena had all the qualities that I admire in an individual. She paused, turning to Helena, and added softly, I guess I don't say that to you much these days, as much as I should. Helena reached over to touch Bernie's hand before continuing. I had a flat in Belgrave Square, which I shared with Pauline O'Donnell. Bernie came back to stay with me, and that's how it started. I later asked him about the Hirschfeld itself, remarking that they spoke warmly of the building and the centre, and they seemed to have felt gratitude for its existence. Helena sat back for a moment, thinking of that first night in 1982. I think we were very privileged to be there during that time. I think it was a great meeting place for us. It was a place where we could dance together, be together. Bernie nodded before saying a little emotionally, it was the main part of our courtship and getting together. It is where we met, and I will always remember that. It was a sanctuary, and I will always thank it for bringing us together. So here, in their own first encounters, Bernie and Helena started their love story and partnership that lit the spark for them to be together for 43 years. So first encounters weren't always anxiety-ridden. They often led to first love. These are just one of the couples whom we encountered who found not just sex or kissing on the dance floor of Flikkers, but love. And they're important stories to tell as well. And even just interacting with them, seeing the emotionality between the two of them, the oral history interview served as a means for Bernie to say to Helena, I actually should say this to you more often, that, you know, you had all the qualities that I admire in somebody. So to our final theme, and I'll wrap up then, and then we'll have some questions, don't worry, I don't have too much longer, is Flikkers and fragmented remembrance. Flikkers was very controversial in terms of, not controversial in terms of it as an institution, but in terms of how it was remembered by project participants. Lots of conflict, lots of schisms, lots of divides, but also lots of fun. So Flikkers, anyone know what Flikkers means? We were talking about it earlier, yes, I see you laughing. Flikkers is reflective of, again, that desire in the Irish queer community for speaking towards queer European cosmopolitanism. It's the Dutch word for faggots. So Tony Walsh had spent a summer, not Tony Walsh, someone had spent a summer in the Irish Gay Rights Movement and the National Gay Federation in Amsterdam and had heard the word Flikkers being used as a slur. And they went, oh, it's actually a great name for a disco. And also no one in Ireland will know what this means. So you can also now get Flikkers t-shirts. Brian Teeling, a visual artist in Ireland, creates them and sells them. And the money goes to charity. But they're really great t-shirts. I forgot to pack mine. I should have worn it today. So Flikkers is part of this queer European cosmopolitanism, and it literally becomes the best disco in town. When Flikkers was developed, the dance space, Edmund Lynch, of course, gets to professional national song contest set, but also he's working in TV production. So he gets sound engineers from RTE, Radio Telefishern, our national broadcaster, to install the sound system. So the sound system is one of the most top quality in the city. And they start creating a significant talent with regards to DJs. So dancing at Flikkers was fractured and a contested practice, linked to emotions, feeling safe, but also feeling somewhat aloof, feeling disconnected. In interviews, Hirschfeld denizens not only reflected on the centrality of dance, but also what were the socio-political dynamics that came out in the dance floor. Who was welcome versus who was not. And it also becomes an embodied medium where power and privilege and culture and gender norms become negotiated frequently. So one of the really prominent recollections of the Flikkers dance floor was smell of poppers. So the dance floor was wooden, so consistently everyone would be on the dance floor sniffing away, passing bottles around, and the bottles consistently fell. So, and again, if you've ever smelled poppers, it's a smell and a half. So the smell seeps into the wood, and essentially that first floor of the Hirschfeld Centre was just smelled of poppers the whole time, because the wood retained the liquid and retained the smell, and it got, of course, reupholstered and it got re-glazed every night, let's just say. So that is one of the crucial aspects, but it was a cutting edge musical archive for varying reasons. Flikkers didn't just play music, it actually invested in creating a really significant sound, but also a really significant talent base. It, firstly, and the way in which Flikkers got records was absolutely insane. So Tony O'Shea was the centre manager of the Hirschfeld, and whenever he would go on holidays, he would, to a major city, he would look up what the local record company was, where the headquarters were. So in one instance, he went to New York, found where Sony were, and went into them and said, hey, we run this disco in Dublin, do you have any promotional vinyls you can give us? And they went, yeah, sure, there's this girl who's not going to go anywhere next year, take her vinyls, and it was Madonna. It was Madonna's Holiday single. And they gave them to and Madonna got the first play in Ireland at Flikkers in the Hirschfeld, a year before she broke into the charts in Europe. So these kinds of networks were established with record labels to bring a really rich sound to Dublin, to such an extent that Flikkers was not just popular with the queer community, the straights started to go there because the sound was just so good, the music was current. They had a Flikkers top 10 that was updated every week that was reflective of the US chart, so they were really on it. They also developed a really cutting edge, high energy sound, and the DJs were given space to develop their talent. They were put into residencies in the likes of Berlin, in nightclubs, and also the Garage in New York, and they would model the sounds that they would hear from DJs there, learn the decks there, and come back with that experience to create this really rich sound at the Hirschfeld. So the DJs become true global reach, and these forms of local innovation, they become trailblazers. And also the denizens themselves become really crucial to shaping and contouring that. So for example, on Women's Night, they would only play women's songs and women's tracks. James Morrison, James Morrison had a trial for domestic abuse at the time, and the women basically said you can't play his music because of this. Donna Summer was banned for a while over her comments around AIDS and gay men. So, the playlist was also political in a lot of instances. So it was a whole new world where you could experiment. Now I do have a small clip. It may work, and you'll see all the vintage gays doing their thing. Ignore all my tabs, please. Yes, Guy, that is one of your papers I was reading earlier, so. Before this was going to be broadcast, or before it was going to be shot, they announced that this was going to be happening. Let's see if there's. Yes, so before they were going to. No, stop that. Not yet. Before they were going to shoot this clip, they announced it to everybody. RTE is coming in to shoot the Flikkers dance floor. What would be absolutely jammed and packed ends up being empty because people couldn't risk being seen and going out on national television. So just that's why it looks empty. It was never that empty before. So. So a bit of dodgy dancing there, but vintage and of its time, so we won't judge. I certainly won't anyways. So it becomes a soundtrack of sophistication and survival. And dancing becomes a form of defiance. Walt Kilroy, for example, says it goes way beyond hedonism. It's dancing at Flikkers was an act of liberation, of self-affirmation, an act of community building, and becomes a really significant public ritual, a form of queer joy, and anthems of belonging emerge. So Tom Robinson's Glad to be Gay becomes a call to the dance floor for many people. The Pointer Sisters, again, is I'm so excited, is a call to the dance floor. So these become really significant ways in which I suppose, solidarity and fun and joy with the community starts to emerge. But of course, there are fractures on the dance floor. The partying in Flikkers, or the partying including dancing in Flikkers, is actually a profoundly political act, as Walt Kilroy says. But Bernie Fagan's interview demonstrated how gender dynamics between gay men versus lesbians emerged on the dance floor. She says there were gay men who didn't want to stare and who would physically block our entrance. Then you hear the fellow talking about the smell of fish. It was awful. So misogyny emerges in some instances here. And then Jerry Moore, outside of gender dynamics, Jerry talks about, within gay men themselves, how hierarchies emerge around body types, looks. So clones, so think of Freddie Mercury, that was a clone during the 1980s. And the clones were the big muscle guys with the Freddie Mercury mustaches and tight vests and tight 501 jeans and builder's boots. They were quite snobbish and quite cliquey. So the clones would dominate the dance floor and oftentimes kind of sideline people who are not in their clique and put them out there. So Flikkers also has some funny tidbits in it. Elton John once went there. He was performing in the National Concert Hall. He was coming to town, so his request was mimosa. So they got orange juice Prosecco in for him. He's apparently lovely, very nice. Whitney Houston, I recently discovered, went there. Who else? Lots of interesting people. Jimmy Somerville was another one. So that's fractures on the dance floor in terms of Flikkers. So that brings me then to conclusions and then to questions with you all. So what does this say? What does this mean? What does rebricking the Hirschfeld as an ephemeral archive through oral history testimonies tell us? Firstly, these oral histories have revealed a lot to me, but also a Boston connection. And I think it's relevant now that we're here in this room at Boston College to actually share with that. Niall Sweeney was a graphic artist, a visual artist, really prominent now, and he came to Boston during the summer and he was placed in Gay Community News. He interned with them, did some graphic work with them, worked on their front pages, Gay Community News Boston here on the right, and his experience at Gay Community News Boston becomes really crucial to Gay Community News Dublin emerging from the Hirschfeld Centre. The Hirschfeld Centre is where Gay Community News actually emerges and is founded, and Niall Sweeney's work on that publication informs the aesthetic, the look that Gay Community News Dublin has. So Boston queer activism directly influencing the Irish queer media in that sense. So that's just something to think of. But critical tensions emerge in memory and remembrance, and a diversity of experience. And there's many things that I haven't discussed that are here, but just to kind of go over them, you know, a lot of people were hurt over how the centre finished. Do the community own it? Do the shareholders own it? So for example, David Norris, Edmund Lynch, Bernard Keogh buy this building as Hirschfeld Enterprises Limited, as the commercial arm that's running it, but the day-to-day running is happening with the community volunteers. So when the building is destroyed, should they benefit, even though the mortgage is paid off, or does it belong to the community? So a lot of those tensions actually emerge within the oral history forms of remembrance even. Rebuilding the centre, is it community reinvestment or is it shareholder profit? This is a divide that is emerging time and time again. Conflicting perceptions of control. Some remember the Hirschfeld as an inclusive space, whereas others say it was a space where middle-class gay men ran the show and everyone else was sidelined. Again, a significant diversity of experiences here. Lesbians versus gay men, there were significant tensions with regards to space. Women actually having to campaign to get a night, which ended up becoming Thursdays, which gay men didn't want to give over because it was crucial economically. Flikkers made a lot of money on Thursdays. To give it over to 60 women meant that it was not going to give them profit. But the point of the women was, we don't care about profit. Thursdays internationally are women's nights, so we should be giving a space one night a week. And then you have labour and enjoyment. So lots of people who actually ran the building did it voluntarily, but they never profiteered from any of the gains made from it. And was that fair? So that brings me to re-bricking the Hirschfeld. So our work shows how oral histories can rebuild a lost queer space as an ephemeral archive and aim to keep its stories alive through resilience and resisting forgetting. It also demonstrates that there is a multiplicity of meaning. The Hirschfeld Centre has different meanings for different people. There will be never one singular Hirschfeld Centre again because the building is destroyed, but there will be many Hirschfeld Centres in people's imaginaries and constellations as they recall and remember. Also, grafted memories. Grafted memories is a work W.J. Newsom has conceptualized in his work on the Pink Triangle in recent years, and also I'm seeing it emerge in interviews. People will take memories of others, think they're their own, and then I have to go back and say, so Geraldine said that she was actually the person managing the phone lines and that you weren't, and then she goes, oh Jesus, I must have heard Geraldine tell the story so many times, I must have taken that on board as my own memory. So you see grafted memories actually start to emerge here. But we also see the significance of collaborative memory work. In doing this work on Waking the Hirschfeld, how collaboration and iteration and flexibility are significant, that we can't necessarily think of oral history as this method that is A to B, C to D, but something that is iterative with participants, that needs to shift, that needs to change, that needs to be responsive and reactive to how participants want to engage with the project or how they want to remember. And it's not just a one and done sort of a thing, but that you have a collaborative relationship that you're working with communities. But also, the project's a call to action to keep the Hirschfeld awake, challenges forces that prefer queer histories hidden or erased. A message I think that is more important now in the current climate, especially in the US right now. Memory is resistance, and to capture and to tell these stories is a form of power and resistance. And then crucially, it's a call to action. Queer spaces like the Hirschfeld, yes, methodologically interesting in terms of how we can engage with communities, how we can use oral history and queer oral histories as a method, but also how intergenerational dialogues are crucial, how transnational dialogues are ongoing. And we are, among myself and my collaborator, two people of many that need to keep this work going and going strong. So to re-break the Hirschfeld first demands the highly emotional memory work of our community narrators. As Ashley Ward argues, oral histories can offer the opportunity to examine the complexities and intricacies of place, noting that the function of physical structure requires expansion through oral histories. So W.J. Newsom, and I'll conclude with this, offers the concept of grafted memories, a framework for understanding how researchers like ourselves, exploring a place and a time that eludes us in a material sense, memories may originate externally, but they can ultimately become enmeshed in one's own subjective memory and sense of place in history. The collaborative process of this research, which involves community informants and grafted memories that we bring to bear may enable us to rebuild a Hirschfeld Centre out of the memories of those who lived it, and those who loved it, and those who love it, and to further contribute to the ongoing discussion of the significance and meaning of queer political and cultural space. Thank you all so much for indulging me. And I'm happy to take any kind of question or otherwise. So, yes?
One thing you spoke about was different experiences of like gender within the Hirschfeld, especially like thinking about the dance floor or women-led artists on Women's Night. Were there other experiences you encountered in these oral histories of gendered experience, especially things like drag?
Where I say there are mistakes here, the mistakes are my own. We're reconstructing a space that has no archive, that's based entirely nearly solely on memory, and these mistakes are going to be inevitable. So that's the first part of your question. Your second part was, how do I select voices in terms of framing and whatnot? So yeah, that is everyone. I try to make sure everyone's voice is included because they've given time to this project, and it's really important that they feel firstly that their voices are valued and that they see themselves in print and that their stories are archived in some sort of way. So there is that emotional affect to ensure. So I have that mission that everyone gets into the book at least once. And how I tend to couch them is often I will write it in terms of narrativize it. So there's instances where I'll have little pieces that sort of go into being somewhat like fiction. So just like with the Bernie and Helena thing, I kind of narrativize my interactions with them. In other instances, I will just put up blocks of text because the voice of the oral history narrator needs to actually come through. So I try to ensure that everyone gets at least one block of text in there in terms of what they're saying. And it's important that I'm not I do paraphrase, don't get me wrong, in some instances, but with oral history, it's really important that the voice of the narrators are there in terms of what they've said. So I try to honor and respect that as well. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Guy, I saw your hand up. And then
I'd like to continue with that. Those are excellent kind of sort of questions that Quinn raised there. And I really appreciate also that you're sharing work in progress, which is towards the book, and you're kind of opening your methodology for us. So one of the things that struck me was the way it seemed, at least now, but I'd like you to get a fuller picture, people waiving their anonymity. So a lot in oral history is people saying, people using coded names, changing names, but it looks here as an act of reclaim. People want their name to be there,
yes,
which is interesting. And this leads me at least in my thought, and you wanting also to give everybody a space, like you said now, so everybody gets to tell a bit of their story and their name will be in the book. But it also tells a lot about the difference between now and then. What can be done now in public, what can be done then. And that's an interesting part of the story, which can be seen in different terms from the way you engaged before in the answer to Quinn there of misremembering. Because of course the present is always there in oral history, right? It's always the present and the past. Things have changed. Even the terms that we used then, as you gave in your answer to Joanna before, transvestite would have been used then, now we probably prefer transgender, right? Or in different cases, right? Or cross-dressing would be less used. So language changes over time. On the one hand, you want to recapture the moment, but on the other hand, you're also discussing with people now who are retelling it in a different way, and that leads to some of the dynamics that you covered as in grafted memory, right? People are claiming things changing, bringing in the condom machine, which is a later kind of invention, but bringing it back in time.
Yeah.
So if you'd like to talk a bit about that, because I think that's actually a subject in itself, which is essential to the book. That's part of what memory is. Memory is not just taking us back in time, it's about the whole journey of reworking it.
Really fascinating things you've raised, especially in terms of language. We've had people that refuse to engage with the project because we had queer in the title. And I absolutely, totally, wholeheartedly appreciate why a lot of people who grew up in the 60s and 70s, why queer is an aberration for them. It was the slur that was used against them. And I do try and reason with them, kind of going, queer has all of these multifaceted meanings now, but people just outright said, no, I'm not participating in the project. I had one really interesting, at the start of an oral history interview, it was a really critical person that we needed to speak with, and we finally found him, and he said, look, listen, I know queer is in the title here, I'm going to give you everything, my story. I don't like queer, but I understand how language changes, how it evolves, and I'm going to let you put it to use in terms of how you want to put it to use. But my politics is queer is not something that I appreciate. But he was kind of basically waiving the right for us to kind of use that. So that was a really interesting thing that happened. And then the other flip side to that was gender critical aspects, right? So people who reject queer because they read that as trans. And that was a significant aspect of it. The people who are anonymous in the book, so there is 10% around, so 10 people, sorry, not even 10, 5 people choose to have pseudonyms. And they do that because their views on gender have changed and they don't want to be identified by anyone. So that is definitely a really interesting dynamic that also emerged. So language really is interesting. And transvestite, using that word in the book, really has been interesting. So it got pushback from some reviewers when we kind of submitted it through a process going, you can't use this is disgraceful, blah, 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 blah. So we kind of went, so for example, Judith, I went to Judith's family and I was like, is this okay? And then they were like, yes, absolutely. Judith identified as transvestite. Transvestism is a significant part of the history of trans and trans theory. And they were like, Judith may have identified as non-binary now, but we can't put contemporary historical or contemporary categories onto something that she defined historically at a particular moment in time. So yeah, that all emerges in terms of the then versus the now, and those temporal arrangements with how we think about remembrance, but writing that then in a somewhat volatile context where even within the community itself, there are now divisions in relation to gender critical feminism, in terms of trans identities, and our ideology is, inclusion, all those kinds of things, of course, but we encounter these kinds of personalities and these knots in the research. So again, we try to square those circles the best way that we can. But the then and the now really does emerge time and time again. I'm trying to think, is there any other instances then in terms of the remembrance? No, I think that's kind of what much what I have to say to the other guy in that one. But yeah, that's actually making me think now that I probably should self-reflexively put that in the introduction in terms of framing that then and now dynamic. I think yourself and then yourself and yourself.
Certainly. You or Christian Dupont in the Earth Library, so I was just really interested in the Boston connection there. You kind of asked her a little quickly about the Boston. Did I hear right you saying that the Boston gay community and the gay community news was influential there, right?
It absolutely was.
And I don't know how much you know about the paper or Boston, and it's so maybe just expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, no, my knowledge of the Boston gay community, this is a connection I discovered very recently, having gotten the invites. So I can't necessarily speak to it too much. It will be in the book though, however, and I will absolutely elaborate on it. But yeah, Niall Sweeney essentially came and worked on the publication and came with the idea of it being a broadsheet, like the format of, and he kind of suggested to Tony Walsh, and it was kind of considered a authority, because prior to that the publications in Irish queer media were sort of magazines and pamphlets, and they saw what was happening, and Tony Walsh himself was like a fiend for looking at international best practice and he was one of the founders of GCN, and he saw Boston gay community news and kind of went, that sort of really broadsheet style brings an air of authority, and Tony really wanted gay community news to be a queer paper of record. He wanted it to be the Irish Times for the Irish queer community, as it were. That was sort of an ambition that he had. And he saw Boston Gay Community News as functioning in that sort of space and saw the longevity it had by that stage. So that's kind of some of the threads I'm beginning to unpack with regards to that. And then kind of the visual style is kind of in the early GCNs and GCN from the same period. You can actually see the visuals quite similar to each other. So
you're continuing to do more work on that then, yeah?
Yes, 100%.
We have sources here, and we should talk after. Okay.
Absolutely, yes. I actually visited the archive in Boston on my last trip, and to find Niall in there, and I did. So that was a good way of demonstrating that it happened. So yes, thank you for that. Sorry, where was it? Yourself, and then yourself.
Thank you, Páraic. Thank you. I appreciate so much the work that you're doing here. It's multi-layered. There's the insertion of voices for the first time into the symbolic. I mean, that's very significant. And then there's the interpretive framework that you're bringing to this, to organize this, facilitated by your oral the archival material is oral. It probably gives some more flexibility with that. So I really appreciate what you're doing here, and it seems very significant. Memory is and your effort in that to include memory and the vagaries of memory. It is notoriously difficult to work with. It is unreliable. It is subjective. And I like the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan suggested that truth nearly always has the structure of fiction. So and what I take from that is you don't worry too much about the inconsistencies with these things, that if there's a lie or if there's an inconsistency, that in itself means something. That there's a significance and a meaningfulness to that in some kind of way. And I really appreciate how what you're doing, you're trying to include some of those inconsistencies and difficulties with it, so as to include as many of those voices as possible. It's not an easy task to work with memory.
No, and you've triggered me to my Lacan seminars for my undergrad, so thank you for bringing it back up. With Moyna Sullivan, actually, brought in Lacan. But yeah, no, there is a story to the lies in some instances. And sometimes they're not intentional lies. People actually sometimes remember and re-remember themselves. In particular, they will always, the ego does emerge in some of these interviews, for sure. The egocentric tendencies, especially in terms of not the denizens and the patrons that just went there for a dance, a kiss, or whatever, but people who are involved in the actual formal politics, who will platform their positions to be more than they were, that they did more than they actually did, or that they will remember the version of history that suits them better. And that, as you say, is a story in and of itself.
It speaks to something, some kind of truth in that.
And what I do is I let people say what they want to say, and I put their voice in there, and it's up for people to dispute that in future, right? So yeah, really, really important, crucial. Sorry, yourself, and then Patrick.
Can you share or can you get access to the Flikkers playlist? I'm really curious.
Oh, 100%, yes. I will share that with Rachel if that's okay, and then that will be available via Rachel.
Great, thank you.
I did have a QR code which did not make it in there.
Rachel, how are you going to post that? Maybe that's the no, seriously,
I can post it online, and also if you email the Irish Studies email, irish.studies@bc.edu, you inherently get me. So I will share it with you.
I'm actually just looking at it now just to kind of give you a sense of what's on it. Let me see what made it onto this. They're the most recurring tracks, so...
I'm curious, is Under Cleary's clock on there? By the radiators from space?
No, it never. Yes, Ed Madden has a great article on Under Cleary's clock, by the way.
Really?
Yes. If I'll send you details of that afterwards.
Oh,
so Dionne Warwick, I'll Never Love This Way Again. That was in there. One thing I didn't say about Flikkers, it had a slow set. It was like a parish dance where gay men would, at one point in the night, and literally it was there because the DJ needed to go to the toilet. So the pragmatism of needing to use the toilet made the DJ put on a slow set. So he put on Dionne Warwick's I'll Never Love This Way Again. And that would be the opportunity for everyone to pick their dance partner and dance. And saying that the slow set was one of the most radical aspects of Flikkers, because it was this intimate moment where you're dancing like so many people did at parish halls throughout Ireland. And to do that with a same-sex partner on a dance floor in Temple Bar that's dilapidated around you was just so radical. So Dionne Warwick is there, Take On Me, naturally enough. Viola Wills performed at the Hirschfeld live. Martha Wash from the Weather Girls performed there. These are bits I should have put in there, sorry now. Glad to Be Gay, Whitney Houston, Holiday, Don't Leave Me This Way, The Communards, Depeche Mode, Blue Monday, New Order, Diana Ross naturally, Chain Reaction was a prominent one. Nina, 99 Red Balloons, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, of course, Relax. Tears for Fears, Everybody Wants to Rule the World. Tiffany, I Think We're Alone Now. Gloria Gaynor. Bananarama, was Bananarama big in the US? Did they get over here? Yeah, with Bananarama. Donna Summer until she was banned for a while, and then she came back. Aretha Franklin, Eurythmics, Annie Lennox, Laura Branigan, Pet Shop Boys. So yeah, they're the kind of prominent ones that have come through. So that gives you a sense of the Flikkers playlist. and much more there on that one. So yes, Rachel will share that with you all, if that's okay, Rachel. And the question here.
Yeah, this is a little bit in relation to Guy's question of then and now, but more about then and also then. You know, you're looking at this approximately 8-year period. I'm wondering, are you viewing at all, and obviously memory is so messy, and we were literally just talking today about how it's not linear. Are you noticing any attempts to locate the experiences within specific moments in the Hirschfeld's history? Or are you noticing any continuities, disruptions over the time in which the Hirschfeld existed? Or I guess is your approach more viewing this as a bubbled moment of kind of non-linear time?
Okay, so really great question, and we actually deal with everything you've just said in the AIDS chapter, because we argue that AIDS becomes this great disruptor of where dissident timelines and temporalities actually begin to emerge. And how we come to this conclusion is because this is the point where so many of the participants, their own memories are fractured. They actually go to themselves, I am so traumatized by this period that I have buried it. It's actually ruptured in my own recollection. I haven't gone to that vault in so many years until you've asked me this question now. So it is a dissident temporal thing that emerges within the oral history exchanges, firstly, but also in their own remembrances, right? Bill Hughes gave this really, really strong interview where he just remembers this beautiful guy, Jan from Czechoslovakia, and his recollection is jumping between the now, the then, and then another moment at the time where he goes, I used to see Jan on the Flikkers dance floor. He was built, typical good-looking gay Eastern European, you know the type. And he was like, oh my God, he's delicious, I want him. And they never did anything, but he was like, he's really good to look at. So they became kind of friendly. And then the memory gets ruptured from his desire for Jan on the dance floor to then he's in James's hospital, which is the AIDS ward in Ireland at the time. And he's going in to see his friend, Vincent Hanley. Vincent Hanley, that's a whole separate story, but he was a very famous TV presenter in Ireland, went on to front Ireland's first music television show, MTUSA, became the first AIDS celebrity death, the Irish Rock Hudson, as it were. So Bill is going in to visit Vincent Hanley, and he looks across the hospital ward, and he sees Jan in the bed beside Vincent, or in the ward in James's. And he's telling the Flicker story, and then he's jumping to Jan in the bed, and Jan dying, and Jan really upset. And then he jumps back to Jan trying to disclose to Bill that he's dying from AIDS. And then Bill jumps to, in the same narration, thinking of Vincent Hanley now. He goes, oh, if Vincent were only alive, he would have been so happy to see marriage equality. So you see all of these dissident timelines and temporal ruptures, you know, the Ireland of now of 2015 and the marriage equality vote. Look at all of these young gay men who died missed out on. So there really are these temporal junctures in the remembrance, and also nostalgia. And some of the informants are really critical of their own nostalgia for this period. And they're like, nostalgia can be very dangerous because AIDS then ruptures that nostalgia of thinking of the Flickers dance floor as this fun place, but nostalgia can't necessarily be a good thing in some of those contexts. So great question. And I'm completely filtering down the argument of that chapter, but that's generally kind of where we're going with that.
I'm excited to.
Amazing, thank you. Any other questions? Patrick, yes. Please be
Thank you
nice.
Thank you so much. This was so fabulous. I can't wait to read the book. It's kind of in the frame of the then and now differences a bit, but the way that you talked about these queer spaces, like I wasn't connected to this space, but the way you talked about queers being connected to spaces really resonated with my own experience coming up and coming out and all that sort of stuff. And I just wonder, have you had the chance, either when you've given presentations about this or teaching this material, like to digital natives, is the sense of space different for, say, our students now than it would have been at different periods? Because even when you were describing the walking interview around the spaces, I kind of heard somewhere in there's a cool kind of assignment to get students to do, to get them to experience the space in a different way. And I wondered if you had that kind of encounter or thoughts or.
Yeah, no, very interesting actually. I mean, because you're kind of seeing, you know, across the US especially and Europe, kind of the death of the gay space. The gay bar is kind of becoming obsolete because of the fact that we now have these convenience applications such as Tinder, Grindr, all of these places where the meetup would have happened in that space where you don't know who you'll see in a bar. The function is taken up by these applications. So in terms of thinking about that in terms of digital natives, it's actually not something that I've necessarily actually kind of thought of in that sense, but definitely with students, for sure, they're definitely, like, even if you go into the likes of these queer spaces now, they're not being used by Gen Z really. And I can see that disparity definitely within the Dublin scene. It's kind of the older queens like myself, of my generation, that are availing of the bars, and that they are sort of becoming more assimilative in terms of queer, or not queer club nights, more alternative radical club nights is kind of where they seem to be going. Also, not many of them are going out anymore. We have a whole sober, curious generation in Ireland now who firstly can't afford drinking because it's so expensive. Secondly, drug use has exponentially increased and they're doing that at home. So the actual place of a queer space, as it would have functioned for generations prior, is actually shifting for reasons not only exclusively associated with digital media, but also these changing cultural material realities where many of them actually just can't afford to go out because what's a drink? A gin and tonic in Dublin's now like a tenner. So yeah, but that's definitely something to think about. I've given you a very undercooked answer to that question, but something I will, I will definitely consider. Thank you, Patrick.
I'd like us to thank, if we can, Páraic, for this was an excellent Flatley lecture,
Thank you.
Current, and at the same time, both current and bring us back in time to,
Then and now.
yeah, to not too long ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you.